Welcome to our new episode.
The Improbable Captain, Robert Smalls and the Night of Utter Audacity. The year is 1862. The Civil War is raging, tearing the American continent in two. Imagine, if you will, the deepest, most suffocating darkness of a pre-dawn hour in Charleston Harbor, South Carolina. The air hangs thick and heavy with the scent of salt marsh and the distant, ever-present threat of cannon smoke. The city, a pearl of the Confederacy, is ringed by its naval defenses, a fortress-like hub of rebellion. The harbor waters are patrolled by Confederate ships, vigilant eyes watching for any move by the blockading Union fleet miles out at sea. Now imagine an enslaved man, one of the millions whose very humanity was denied by the law of the land, standing on the deck of a massive, heavily armed Confederate military transport ship, its massive paddle wheels still and silent. He is not a sailor, legally. He is property. Yet, as he looks out over the black water, he makes a decision so bold, so audacious, so utterly improbable that, were it not a verifiable fact of American history, it would be dismissed as the wildest fiction. He is about to steal the ship, and himself, his family, and a dozen others from under the very nose of the Confederacy, sailing straight into the federal blockade and changing the course of his own life and arguably the war itself. This is the true story of Robert Smalls, the enslaved wheelman who became a captain, a hero, a politician, and a living testament to the fact that the human spirit, when fueled by the desire for freedom, can execute a plot more daring than any military strategist could conceive. Part 1. The Making of a Wheelman in the Cradle of Secession. Robert Smalls was born into slavery in Beaufort, South Carolina, in 1839. His life was, from the start, a contradiction. Unlike many enslaved people who toiled in the brutal, unrelenting fields of the low country plantations, Robert was a house servant. His mother, Lydia Polite, was a privileged house slave for the family of John McKee, a wealthy planter. This proximity to the McKees, while still bondage, afforded Robert a life that was relatively sheltered from the absolute worst brutalities of the field. Yet Lydia, understanding the nature of their reality, often took Robert to the slave auctions and the whippings to ensure he never forgot his true station, instilling in him a profound, visceral hatred of the institution that held them captive. His childhood in Beaufort, a picturesque town of moss-draped live oaks and grand antebellum homes, was a masterclass in observation. Beaufort was a critical seaport, and from a young age, the waterways fascinated Robert. He showed a natural intelligence and an almost preternatural ability to absorb technical knowledge. At the age of 12, at his own request, he was sent to Charleston, the very heart of the secession movement, to be hired out for work. This move, intended to better train him for marketable labor, was the single most pivotal event of his formative years. In Charleston, a bustling port city, Robert found his calling on the water. Over the next decade, he worked a succession of jobs, as a lamplighter, a rigger, and ultimately as a stevedore. Crucially, he gravitated toward the docks, immersing himself in the maritime world. He taught himself to read and write, often in secret, a forbidden act for enslaved people that was punishable by law. More importantly, he learned the intricate language of the harbor. The harbor of Charleston was a maze of tides, sandbars, channels, and lighthouses. A boat captain's knowledge of this complex geography was their most valuable asset. Robert, a quick study, learned it all. By day, he worked on various vessels, eventually finding a stable position on the steamer Planter. Officially, he was a deckhand and a wheelman's assistant. Unofficially, he was the Planter's shadow pilot. The Planter was a sleek, side-wheel steamer, 147 feet long, designed for coastal transport. With the outbreak of the Civil War, the Confederate Army quickly repurposed her. They armed her with a 32-pound pivot gun and a 24-pound howitzer, converting her into a military transport and dispatch vessel. Her mission? To ferry men, supplies, and orders between the Confederate fortifications that protected Charleston, including Fort Sumter, Fort Moultrie, and Fort Wagner. This military assignment turned the planter into an unparalleled school for Robert. As the wheelman's assistant, he was on the bridge constantly. He watched the white officers, especially the white captain, C.J. Releo, navigate the defenses. He memorized every buoy, every shoal, and every signal. He learned the exact rotation of the Confederate sentries, the proper flag etiquette for passing the harbor forts, and the precise steam pressure needed to navigate the treacherous Stono and Folly rivers. His memory, honed by years of surviving as an enslaved man, cataloged every crucial detail. By 1862, Robert Smalls was a highly skilled, though uncredited pilot of the planter. His knowledge of the vessel and the harbor exceeded that of many of the white officers. He was a black man in a captain's uniform, an invisible, walking navigational chart. He was ready. The true motivation for the extraordinary risk he was about to take was not just his own freedom, but the liberation of his family. Robert was married to Hannah Jones, who was also enslaved, and they had 2 young children, Elizabeth and Robert Jr. Hannah and the children lived in Charleston, constantly under the threat of sale or separation. The noose of slavery tightened around Robert's heart every day. He knew, with absolute certainty, that the only way to secure their future was to break the chains himself. The planter was not just a ship, it was a key, the only key to his family's liberty. The plan began to coalesce, a plan so dangerous that a single error would mean torture, a gruesome execution, and the permanent re-enslavement of his loved ones. Part 2. The audacity of the steel. The opportunity came on the night of Monday, May 12, 1862. The planter had been docked at the Charleston Wharf near the headquarters of General Roswell Ripley, the Confederate commander of the 1st Military District of South Carolina. The crew, 3 white officers, Captain Releo, pilot Samuel Smith, and engineer Zerich Smith, and an enslaved crew of 8 men, including Robert Smalls, had spent the day transporting troops and inspecting fortifications. That evening, the 3 white officers, in a display of what can only be described as supreme arrogance and complacency, the fatal flaw of any system built on racial subjugation, decided to spend the night ashore. They left the planter in the care of Robert and the rest of the enslaved crew, a common practice based on the assumption that property could never possess the mental capacity or the will to steal their master's most valuable assets. The officers, perhaps after sharing a round of drinks and feeling entirely secure within the Confederates' main port, simply retired to their homes. Robert Smalls knew this was his moment. The meticulous planning of months, perhaps years, was about to be executed. First, he quietly enlisted the support of the other enslaved crew members. They were all men of the water, wheelman, fireman, and deckhands, and they were all desperate for freedom. Smalls' leadership and calm confidence were contagious. The entire enslaved crew, 8 men, agreed to the dangerous plan. The stakes were impossibly high. If they were caught, they would all be hanged from the yardarm. If they failed to navigate the complex defenses, they would be shelled by their own people. The choice, however, was simple: certain, brutal bondage or a terrifying gamble for absolute freedom. At approximately 3 a.m. on Monday, May 12, 1862, the first part of the plan commenced. Smalls slipped away from the ship and rowed a small skiff to a nearby wharf where his wife Hannah and their 2 children, Elizabeth and Robert Jr., along with 4 other enslaved women, 3 other men, and another child, were anxiously waiting. He had previously informed them with coded whispers to be ready. 17 people, the entire group, were loaded silently onto the ship. They were hidden in the cargo hold, instructed to remain absolutely silent. The slightest sound, a crying child, a nervous cough, could doom them all. Smalls returned to the wheelhouse. He signaled the boiler firemen, also enslaved, to stoke the fires. The ship's twin smokestacks began to puff the heavy white steam of a vessel preparing for movement. At 3:30 a.m., Robert Smalls stood at the wheel of the planter, a vessel he did not own but knew better than anyone else. He gave the order to cast off the lines. Part 3. The Gauntlet of the Forts. The most treacherous part of the escape was passage through the heavily fortified harbor. Smalls had to pilot the ship past 5 Confederate strongholds: Fort Johnson, Fort Moultrie, the heavy batteries on James Island, and most imposing of all, the infamous Fort Sumter, the site of the war's first shots. To an observer on the shore, the planter was simply an ordinary military vessel making its routine early morning rounds. The success of the mission hinged on Robert Small's perfectly impersonating Captain Raleigh. As the planter steamed slowly, deliberately toward the harbor entrance, Smalls did 3 things that ensured their momentary survival. He adopted the captain's mannerisms. Smalls knew Raleigh's routine to the letter. He put on the long, broad-brimmed straw hat and a dark uniform coat which he had found in the captain's cabin. Standing at the wheel, silhouetted in the dawn's weak light, he was an unmistakable figure, the captain, to any distant observer. He used the correct signals. Every Confederate ship passing
A fort was required to give a specific whistle signal and show the appropriate banner. Smalls used the precise whistle signals he had heard Raleigh use countless times. He executed the captain's salute. As the planter steamed directly past Fort Sumter, the most powerful and heavily manned fort, Smalls stood at the wheel, his hand raised in the perfect imitation of Captain Raleigh's signature salute. The sentries at Fort Sumter, seeing the familiar shape of the planter and the familiar-looking figure of the captain giving the customary salute, never suspected a thing. The vessel passed through the choke point unchallenged. The collective sigh of relief from the 17 souls hidden below deck must have been deafening to themselves, but it was lost in the sound of the churning paddle wheels. The moment the planter cleared the range of the Confederate guns, Smalls made another crucial move. He ordered the crew to strike the Confederate flag, the stars and bars, and hoist a simple white sheet, an improvised flag of truce or surrender. This was their declaration. They were now seeking the protection of the enemy. Miles out, the Union Navy maintained a tight blockade. The USS Onward, a Federal blockading ship, was the closest vessel. Its crew spotted the approaching steamer. It was highly unusual for a Confederate vessel to steam out of the harbor and toward the blockade. They were instantly suspicious. The Onward prepared to open fire. The crew of the Onward saw the Confederate flag being lowered and a white flag raised. They saw a figure on the wheelhouse, a black man in a captain's coat. Confusion reigned. A few more agonizing minutes passed as the Onward's commander, Lieutenant J. Frederick Nichols, hesitated, trying to make sense of the situation. He did not want to mistake a surrender for a trap, but he also could not afford to lose a chance to capture a Confederate ship. Finally, the planter pulled alongside the Onward, and Robert Smalls stepped forward, pulling off the captain's hat and delivering a line that would forever etch his name into history. "Good morning, sir. I have brought you some of the old United States guns." He had delivered the planter, its valuable armament, and more importantly, its 17 passengers to the Union side. The audacity had paid off. Part 4. Intelligence, Strategy, and a National Sensation. The immediate reaction aboard the Union fleet was of stunned disbelief, rapidly turning to elation. The capture of the planter was an intelligence coup of monumental proportions. Robert Smalls, the erstwhile enslaved wheelman, became the single most important source of military intelligence in the region. Smalls possessed an intimate, detailed knowledge of the Confederate defenses in Charleston Harbor, the very defenses he had just successfully navigated. He was immediately debriefed by Admiral Samuel Francis DuPont, commander of the South Atlantic Blockading Squadron. Smalls drew detailed maps from memory, indicating the exact placement of mines, called torpedoes at the time, the range of the heavy artillery at Fort Sumter, and the routine patrol patterns of the Confederate Navy. His intelligence was so accurate and thorough that it was instrumental in planning the Union attack on the harbor. Smalls knew the strengths, but also the critical weaknesses. For instance, he revealed that the Confederates had left the guns on the southern end of James Island largely undefended, betting that the shallow Stono Inlet was too dangerous for the Union Navy to traverse. This was a major tactical error for the Confederacy. Smalls proved the inlet could be navigated. Using Smalls's intimate knowledge as a guide, Admiral DuPont immediately had Union gunboats probe the Stono Inlet, and soon a significant Union force was able to take the undefended area. This flanking maneuver placed Federal troops only 10 miles from Charleston, a strategic foothold that would have been impossible without Smalls's courage and knowledge. The story of the planter became an immediate sensation across the North. It was a propaganda dream. Here was irrefutable evidence that enslaved people were intelligent, capable, and most importantly, fiercely loyal to the Union cause, willing to risk everything for freedom. President Abraham Lincoln and Secretary of War Edwin Stanton were personally informed of the incident. In the midst of an election year and mounting pressure to define the war's purpose, the planter escape provided a massive moral boost. It was a powerful counter-narrative to the prevailing racist belief that enslaved people were happy with their bondage or incapable of strategic thought. Smalls became the living embodiment of the war's highest moral cause, abolishment. Part 5. From Pilot to Captain and Beyond. Robert Smalls did not simply fade into the history books after his grand escape. He immediately volunteered for service with the Union Navy. He became a pilot, this time officially and for pay, for the USS Planter, which was commissioned into the Federal fleet. He was the only man capable of piloting the vessel in the treacherous low-country waters. He served with distinction, making 16 perilous coastal missions, often steaming deep into Confederate territory to shell batteries and ferry troops. His bravery under fire was legendary. One of the most famous incidents occurred in 1863 during an attack on the Confederates at the Secessionville battleground. The Union commanding officer on the planter at the time, a white man, became paralyzed with fear under heavy Confederate shelling. He abandoned the pilot house and hid. Smalls, without hesitation, seized control of the wheel and expertly steered the vessel out of danger, saving the ship and the lives of the crew. In recognition of his extraordinary courage and skill, and following a plea from Admiral DuPont, Robert Smalls was officially promoted in 1863 to captain of the USS Planter. He was 24 years old. This was not a symbolic gesture. He was one of the first black men to command a United States vessel, a position of authority over both black and white crew members, shattering a foundational pillar of racist military policy. He served as captain for the remainder of the war until the Planter was decommissioned in 1866. During this time, he personally oversaw the acquisition of 4 Confederate blockade runners, turning their profit over to the U.S. government. His wartime service was merely the prelude to even a more remarkable life in the political arena. Part 6. The Architect of Reconstruction. After the war, Robert Smalls returned home to Beaufort, South Carolina, a free man and a decorated war hero. He was a wealthy man by the standards of the time, earning over $1,000 a year as a captain. With his earnings, he did the unthinkable. He bought the house of his former master, John Mackay, the very place where he had been born into slavery. It was a monumental act of reversal and symbolic justice. The Reconstruction era, 1865 to 1877, was a period of tumultuous social and political change in the South. Smalls understood that military victory was not enough. Political power was essential to secure the rights of his people. He became a towering figure in the emerging black political class of South Carolina, an era often forgotten or misrepresented in American history. His political career was astonishing in its scope. South Carolina State House of Representatives, 1868 to 1870. Smalls was elected to the House, where he quickly established himself as a legislative powerhouse. South Carolina State Senate, 1870 to 1875. He moved to the Senate, playing a key role in drafting the state's 1868 Constitution. This was one of the most progressive state constitutions of the era, establishing free, compulsory public education for all children, regardless of race, and creating a framework for equal civil rights. Smalls was a central figure in creating a truly democratic South Carolina. U.S. House of Representatives, 1875 to 1879, 1881 to 1887. Smalls was elected to the U.S. Congress, serving 5 non-consecutive terms. He was a powerful orator and a champion of civil rights, advocating tirelessly for federal protection of black citizens in the South. He was a staunch Republican, believing the party of Lincoln was the only vehicle for securing the rights of the newly freed. In Congress, Smalls championed landmark legislation, most notably the Civil Rights Act of 1875. He fought against the rise of white supremacist groups like the Ku Klux Klan and warned the nation that the gains of the Civil War were being systematically dismantled by violence and voter suppression. His most intense political battle was the fight for universal male suffrage. Smalls was a fierce proponent of the 15th Amendment, which guaranteed the right to vote regardless of race. He believed that the vote was the ultimate weapon of the freedmen. Part 7. The Betrayal of Reconstruction and the Later Years. The end of Reconstruction was a bitter, violent process. White Southerners who had never accepted the political equality of black men organized to seize back power, often through sheer terror. This era was marked by the rise of Redeemer Democrats and paramilitary groups that used violence, intimidation, and fraud to suppress the black vote and dismantle the progressive legislation Smalls and his colleagues had enacted. Smalls was a constant target. His life was routinely threatened. In 1877, following the corrupt political bargain that ended Reconstruction, where Republicans agreed to withdraw federal troops from the South in exchange for Rutherford Hayes winning the presidency, the floodgates of repression opened. Smalls was convicted on a spurious bribery charge and sentenced to 3 years in prison, a clear attempt by the white supremacist legal system to neutralize him. He was eventually pardoned on the condition that he drop a charge against a white official for a similar offense, a clear political deal that underscored the fragility of justice for black leaders. Despite the loss of federal protection, Smalls refused to yield his political ground. Even as the Jim Crow era took hold, systematically stripping black people of their rights, Smalls continued to fight. He became a customs collector for the Port of Beaufort, a powerful federal patronage position that he held for 2 decades, with brief interruptions during Democratic administrations. He used this position as a local bulwark against white oppression, hiring black men, keeping them employed, and wielding the influence of the federal government to protect his community. In 1895, Smalls made his last, heroic stand against the final, fatal blow to South Carolina democracy, a new state constitution specifically designed to disenfranchise black citizens through literacy tests and poll taxes. Smalls was one of 6 black delegates to the Constitutional Convention, and he fought every article, every clause, with the passion of a man who knew he was battling the end of an era. In one famous, powerful speech to the convention, Smalls, staring down the delegates who were intent on erasing his people's rights, declared, "The only place that a black man is safe in this country is in the United States Senate and in the United States House of Representatives. This Constitution will mark the first time in South Carolina history that a man is allowed to vote not by his property, but by his skin color." His arguments were ignored. The new Constitution was ratified, effectively ending black political power for the next 6 decades. Robert Smalls died in 1815 in the very house he was born in, the one he had purchased from his former master. He died a pauper, having spent the vast majority of his wealth supporting his community, fighting legal battles, and running for office in the face of impossible odds. The life of Robert Smalls is a microcosm of the greatest chapters of American history, a testament to the brutal paradox of slavery, the unparalleled courage of the quest for freedom, the strategic importance of black intelligence during the war, the promise of the Reconstruction era, and the bitter, violent tragedy of its collapse. His story is not just an astonishing tale of a stolen ship. It is the essential story of American democracy's birth, betrayal, and the enduring fight for its soul.
He was the enslaved man who became a captain, a congressman, and a founding architect of the South's only true moment of integrated democracy. His improbable voyage from the docks of Charleston to the halls of the U.S. Congress remains one of the most factual, astonishing, and necessary true stories in American history.